You're now listening to The Brian Callen Show. Considered the hottest podcast in the universe. Now get ready for the heat. Here's Brian Callen.
Ladies and gentlemen, Brian Callen here on The Brian Callen Show with Hunter Motz, as always. And we have Professor Russell Foster here. He is calling us from Oxford. He's a professor there, and he is a sleep expert. And you've written a book, Rhythms of Life, the Biological Clocks that Control the Daily Lives of Every Living Thing. And is that correct? That's
absolutely. In fact, there are two more. There's also Seasons of Life, which discuss annual biology in both animals, plants, and humans. And most recently, a short book called Sleep, A Very Short Introduction by Oxford University Press.
Oh, that's great. Sleep, a very short introduction. One of the things I loved about your TED Talk, and I listened to the hour-long conversation, I think it was almost an hour at least, that you did with the BBC, was, I loved your humor, but sleep is crucial. And every time I talk to a trainer or a coach of athletes, the first thing they'll say, look, how are you sleeping? If you're not sleeping and hydrating, there's no point in continuing this conversation. You got to start there. And we live in a society where sleep is considered to be, if you need a lot of sleep, it's considered to be a weakness.
Yeah. And yet it's one of the fundamental bits of our biology that make us this extraordinary animal. I mean, if you were to come up with creative solutions to complex problems, a night of sleep has been shown repeatedly to actually enormously enhance your ability to do that. If you want a decent sort of social interaction, sense of humor, all those sorts of special things that make us human, then sleep greatly enhances those abilities.
Listening to your speech, when I was listening to you talk, it's actually, I've actually taken the time to get a nap every day. But you talk also about the fact that a nap isn't necessarily as good as a full night's sleep.
You can. The problem with a nap is that so for example, if you have a short nap in the middle of the afternoon, then you can actually enhance your ability to perform for the second half of the day. But the nap shouldn't really be longer than 20 minutes, the data suggests. Because if you go into a deeper level of sleep, then you have that sort of inertia from waking up, and essentially you counteract any benefits of having that sleep. The only thing you have to be careful about with napping is that a nap in the afternoon will reduce the sleep pressure, which will mean that you'll probably sleep later that night. And if the alarm clock is getting you out of bed at the same time every morning, it means your sleep will be reduced, which means you'll need a longer nap in the afternoon. And so you have to be careful with napping that you don't slide into disrupting the sleep at night.
Yeah, that's fascinating to me. That makes total sense. Because I had read that actually, and they've done some studies where you could sleep, if you can stay away for 4 hours and then take no more than a 20-minute nap within those 4 hours. So every 4 hours, if you took a 20-minute nap, you can actually function for a long time that way. Is that true?
Yeah. You can, but many of the processes that are going on in the brain need more than 4 hours, it seems. And so there's nothing really quite like a sort of a full night of sleep. Now, when I say a full night of sleep, the sorts of sleep that we get these days may not be a good reflection of what we were having in a pre-industrial past. There's good evidence that, in fact, that 8 hours the whole sleep episode was 2 hours of winding down at around dusk, 4 hours of consolidated sleep. You may then wake up for half an hour, have a wander round, then have another 4 hours, and then have a sort of a 2-hour transition out of sleep. So people in there are poems from the medieval times saying, "I had a wonderful first sleep," and so this polyphasic or biphasic sleep that people have talked about in the past these days has probably been compressed into a single episode. But it'll be sleep. During the night, as a sort of a block of sleep. It may be divided into two, but it's basically a block of sleep at night.
Now, isn't part of what that wandering around in the middle of the night, wasn't that also partly about sex? Isn't it? I've heard people say that.
Really?
Yeah, I've heard that people say that there's the idea that people would wake up in the middle of the night, and that's when you would wander around the cave and procreate.
All right.
I haven't heard that one.
Hunter Mott out of left field.
Yeah. And What's your source? I mean, have you just made this one up?
Probably. We're talking to a professor at Oxford, for God's sake.
I was feeling left out. Brian was being so smart, and then I tried to impress you all, and that dumbass comment came out of my mouth.
Hunter went to Harvard, so you Oxford
Yeah,
people.
Exactly. It's much lower standard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's fascinating to me, though. We don't live in a society. Most of our lives are structured so that obviously it's very difficult to do that. You have kids, and you're after something, and you get busy, and you travel and things like that. Explain to me, based on, because you did some groundbreaking research. From what I understand, which was that we have cones in our eyes, but what you found was that blind people who may not have those cones were still able to at least react to whether or not there was light or dark. They had a separate set of cones that we didn't know about that are able to regulate our biology. Talk about that a little bit.
Okay, so we have this body clock, this internal representation of a day, which is ticking away, and the point of having a clock is that it can anticipate predictable events within the environment. So, for example, if you know that in 2 to 3 hours you need to be awake and up and active, then you can start to turn your physiology up in anticipation of activity. If you think about the difference in sleep states, from being fully asleep to fully awake, the transition can take 2 to 3 hours. You can't simply switch from one state to the other. So having a clock gives you this ability to anticipate these events within the environment. So you can get out there and exploit the new environment, fully. Now, this internal clock is of no use unless it's set to the external world. Mm-hmm. And, of course, the classic mismatch between our internal biology and the external world is jet lag. You eventually get over jet lag because you are exposed to the local light-dark cycle, and that is the most important signal, locking you onto local time. So we were interested, starting 20 years ago, how does the eye actually detect that light and regulate the body clock? And the big problem was the visual system, which is, of course, what we've studied for 150 years, isn't really good at getting an overall impression of the amount of light in the environment over long periods of time. I mean, to see an image, you grab the light in a fraction of a second, and then essentially you forget you've seen it. So what the eye has been, does for vision is grab a series of snapshots to get images. But to get reliable overall amounts of light in the environment, it didn't make any sense how the classical rods and cones of the eye could generate that impression of brightness and therefore set the body clock. And so we started working actually with mice to begin with, and those mice had hereditary retinal disorders where the classical visual cells, the rods and cones, had broken down. And to our complete amazement, they regulated their body clock absolutely perfectly normal, same sensitivity and all the rest of it.
Wow.
And so we said, well, maybe there's another light sensor within the eye. And I remember when we first proposed this, it was met with absolute horror. People were saying,
how dare you?
Yeah, we've been studying the eye for 150 years. Do you seriously think we've missed an entire class of light sensor? And of course, I was,
which is understandable, isn't it? I mean,
and so of course I was 20 years younger, so I had the confidence to say, well, screw you, I'll do better experiments, and we did.
Wow.
And eventually that turned out to be the case. There is another light sensor completely different from the visual system. Now, those cells, the optic nerve, that great sort of tract of nerve cells that leaves the eye and goes into the brain, about the cells that form the optic nerve are called the retinal ganglion cells. And about 1 to 2 in 100 of those cells is directly light sensitive and fires off projections to the clock centers of the brain and, in fact, other structures as well, the sleep centers of the brain. And it's providing our brain with a sense of brightness and for the clock, time of day.
That's such a what a eureka moment for you. That's pretty wild.
It was really exciting, but the mouse work was replicated in humans. That we are like mice in the sense that we have this novel light sensing system as well. Oh, and if you think about it, it's really important because you can be visually blind, but if you've still got those other cells working, then you are not completely blind. And this is not broadly known in ophthalmology. So, for example, you go to your ophthalmologist and they'll explain what it's like to go blind, but they won't explain what it's like to have unremitting jet lag for the rest of your life. The appreciation. Yeah. Our eyes give us our sense of space, but also our sense of time.
Has anyone...
And so what's exciting now in Oxford, we're developing the evidence-based protocols to give to ophthalmologists to say, look, if you've got this sort of retinal disease, then this individual still needs to be instructed to seek out sufficient daytime light to regulate their body clock. They certainly shouldn't be encouraged to wear dark glasses unless there's a really good reason otherwise.
Oh, that's interesting. Wow. Oh, yeah, I see, because you see a lot of blind people wearing dark glasses, but that keeps them, I guess, in a state of darkness all the time.
Exactly, and it cuts off that essential signal to set the clock onto local time. It's even worse, though, because there has been a tendency to say, well, you're blind, your eyes are no use to you, they're difficult to look after because you can't see, there's a potential source of infection here. Why don't we just take them out? Because they're no use to you anymore. Jesus. We'll pop some glass ones in, and it'll be so much easier for everybody. And then unwittingly, you've taken that critical light signal to the clock, and you know, as I said, it'll be like unremitting jet lag for the rest of your life. So an appreciation of these cells is slowly getting into clinical ophthalmology, but it's taking some time.
And what are the cells called?
They're called photosensitive retinal ganglion cells.
Duh, of course they are. You don't know that?
pRGCs.
pRGCs.
Yeah.
I can't wait to go to an eye doctor and just drop that knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely.
You don't know that? You don't listen to my podcast?
God.
It's really one of the great things about doing a podcast is I never would have had a chance to talk to somebody like you who does groundbreaking work on us. Do we not regulate through our skin, through our skin cells?
No, I mean, we do need light exposure to hit the skin to make vitamin D. But what's been shown time and time again is that if you have no eyes, and they've been lost as a result of some ghastly accident, and we're studying people actually in Oxford who have congenital diseases where their eyes have never developed. Their clock is there ticking away, but they can't set the clock to the light-dark cycle, even though, of course, you know, they can expose their skin to light and all the rest of it. Yeah, vitamin D is actually... Yeah, really, really important, but not for the regulation of the clock.
You talk about how shift workers, when they work at night, they still can't really, it's just not good for higher rates of cancer. They can't digest certain foods. I mean, there are all kinds of problems. Even though you're trying to get enough sleep, I guess we've evolved to regulate by the sun, by that kind of light.
Exactly, and in fact, you know, it's the reason we wrote the first book, Rhythms of Life, is I was at a meeting where the chairman of the Confederation of British Industry stood up and said, we're going to cure the problems of British industry, we're going to run it on a 24-hour basis, we're going to get rid of the rush hour, we'll use office space efficiently and all the rest of it. And his assumption was that night shift workers adapt to the demands of working at night. And that's the fatal flaw. They don't. You can be on the night shift for 20 years and you never fully adapt. And the reason, of course, is those photosensitive retinal ganglion cells. You're under relatively dim light in the factory or in the office, then you experience bright natural light on the way home or during the day, and the clock always defers to the brighter light signal as being daytime, and you're locked on. If you take night shift workers, and this is work that was done at Harvard, you'll be pleased to know.
Well, occasionally they do something worthwhile, even if my first comment of this podcast was not part of that.
Ruined
Yeah. Okay. And if you increase the amount of light in the workspace and then hide those individuals from natural light during the day, they will eventually lock on to the light dark cycle that they're experiencing at night. So you can shift it, but of course what that means is you'll have to hide from natural light during the day.
Like a vampire, like Nosferatu, ladies and gentlemen.
Yes, and so that's of course unacceptable to most individuals. So that's the fundamental problem, and so what happens is that you're having to override the desire to go to sleep on the night shift. And you're probably doing that by activating the stress axis. Now, of course, short-term activation of the stress axis is good. You know, it's our fight or flight response. But it's that sustained activation of the stress axis that causes the metabolic problems, the cardiovascular problems, the immune suppression, and all the rest of it. The other big problem that the night shift worker faces is that, of course, while they're trying to sleep during the day, although the sleep pressure is really high, the body clock is saying, hang on, it's daytime, you need to be awake. And so you don't get really good sleep even when you're trying to sleep during the day. So many night shift workers get, 5.5 hours out of every 24? And if you did that to a political prisoner, you'd be up in front of some tribunal somewhere.
Wow.
That's amazing. We do need, explain to me, you're talking about good sleep. What are the, I know that we have REM sleep and you need to get your REM sleep and that's when you dream. I guess, but what do we know about sleep now? What do we know about the stages of sleep, and what are the sleep stages? I mean, I would imagine we start with a light sleep, we get into very deep sleep, and then we come out slowly. Is that? But what?
Well, so the process, and of course this has been studied for 50 years or more. If you stick sort of electrodes to the surface of the skin, you can record the gross electrical activity of the brain during the different sleep states. And what happens is that as you go from the wake state to the deep sleep, the size of the electrical activity and the speed of the electrical activity changes. So basically, it's very, very small, very, very, very fast when you're awake. And as you slide into non-REM 1, 2, 3, and 4, it gets bigger and slower. And states 3 and 4 are deep sleep or slow wave sleep. Now, slow wave sleep has been associated with the laying down of memories in particular. And so slow wave sleep is very good for the processing of information, for example. And then you bounce from slow wave, sort of non-REM 4, very rapidly through 3, 2, 1, and then into REM sleep, which means rapid eye movement sleep. And lots of things are going on then. The most notable is, of course, the eyes are moving very rapidly backwards and forwards, hence rapid eye movement sleep. But you're also experiencing what's called atonia, which is paralysis, essentially from the neck down. So you can't move. And there are conditions called REM behavioral disorder where you don't get that paralysis. And people have murdered other people, they've committed sex acts during this REM behavioral disorder, and essentially the brain, all of that stuff that you're effectively acting out your dreams.
Is that what sleepwalking is?
No, you see, sleepwalking is going on during the non-REM sleep, because during REM sleep you're normally paralyzed. So sleepwalking will occur. Normal sleepwalking will occur during non-REM sleep when you don't suffer that paralysis.
And why do some people sleepwalk and not everybody sleepwalks?
Yeah, and it changes with age, and it's not clear, and it's one of those things that many kids have and grow out of. So it's not something to be particularly worried about.
I did it. Yeah. I did it, and look at how successful I am. Keep going.
From a legal perspective, like if you murder someone in REM sleep, are you
good
legally
good luck proving that?
I mean,
you're gonna have to get Professor Russell Foster from Oxford.
Well, it was actually, it's interesting you should mention that, because somebody did murder their wife under this condition. They claimed their defense was REM behavioral disorder, and it was diagnosed, and they were fully acquitted as not being responsible for their actions.
Why didn't OJ do that? I mean, I
murdered her. You gotta drive a car, brother.
I murdered her and drove down the 405 while in...
That's got to be very rare, though. Yeah,
it is very rare. Yeah, and it happens. It's most commonly found, although it is very rare, in middle-aged men.
Oh, really?
So Brian,
that makes sense when you're really tired of your wife.
Yeah, you and OJ.
What I get myself into, man. This is crazy. We are all of us would like to sleep less and more efficiently. That may be until we come up with some kind of a drug. I don't know, but are we? First of all, what do we do to get a better night's sleep? Dark room, dark room. How about a sound machine?
So basically, this is a whole area now that's called good sleep hygiene, and so there are a number of things that you need to do before you go to sleep to get yourself, in the right sort of mindset. So minimal light exposure for at least half an hour before you go to bed. I mean, it's extraordinary. The last thing that many of us do before we go to bed is stand in a really brightly lit bathroom.
Yeah,
you're cleaning our teeth, and in fact, that's the worst thing. We need to have as low a light as you can tolerate before you go to bed, and because what light will do was increase levels of alertness and then delay sleep. Another important trick is, of course, the bedroom must be dark, and you must stop all the texting, the gaming, computers. iPad, all of that. Yeah, turn all those computers off, because that's doing two things. The light from the screen is increasing alertness. It's probably not going to have a big effect on shifting the clock, although we don't know that yet. People are working on it. But certainly even relatively low levels of light as you get from those screens will increase levels of alertness. And so stop doing all that stuff. Dark room, a little bit cool. Many people's bedrooms are overheated. And that's kind of interesting because that's been associated with what normally happens is you slide into sleep. Is that you drop about a degree, just under a degree in core body temperature. And if you block that small drop in body temperature, you find it more difficult to go off to sleep. And so for example, there are conditions where the blood vessels of the hands and feet constrict. And that means you can't shunt blood from the core, where it's hot, to the periphery and lose that heat. And when you warm up people's hands and feet who've got that condition, their sleep improves. So, our grandparents were telling us, wear bed socks and mittens. And that was to promote the blood vessels of the periphery to dilate, shunting blood from the core to the periphery. You lose that little bit of heat and you can slide into sleep more easily. So make sure the bedroom isn't too hot.
One of the things about it's funny. Just a side note. Just when you have hypothermia, a lot of times they'll find people freeze to death. They're naked, and what happens is, I guess, the blood rushes to the all that blood that was keeping your organs warm. Once it gives up, all that blood rushes to your extremities, and you feel like you're burning up. And so people, because they're disoriented, take all their clothes off. So they'll find a lot of people who died, froze to death with they've taken their clothes off at the very end. It's interesting. Morbid, but interesting. But what are we getting to a point? I'm sorry, Hunter. Are we getting to a point though where we will come up with technologies, drugs that allow us to sleep less? Like Provigil, from what I understand, can keep you awake for a long period of time, and it's not a stimulant; it does something else.
Well, it's also called Modafinil, Provigil Modafinil. Was developed originally in France to deal with narcolepsy, and narcolepsy is a defect in the neurons of the brain that help keep you awake. And it's a sort of a neurotransmitter called orexin or hypocretin. So what happens is that people with this condition would sort of just fall asleep. And Modafinil Provigil has been shown to be really good taken during the day at keeping you awake. It's affecting some of the brain neurotransmitters that keep us awake. And the thing about Modafinil is that when you stop taking it, you don't have the coming down effects that you get, for example, from amphetamines. So in the first Gulf War, many of the troops were actually using illicit amphetamines to deal with staying awake for 24, 48 hours. And in fact, there was some friendly fire by US troops on Canadian troops. And they said, well, hang on, it's not our fault. You were expecting us to stay awake all this time. You knew we were taking things like amphetamines, and you didn't stop us. And so hence the friendly fire. So Modafinil Provigil, a lot better than amphetamines. But the problem with all of these things is we don't know what the long-term use will be. And so the brain is this extraordinary plastic thing. And if you give it whatever, a stimulus, it needs usually more and more of the same stimulus to give the same effect. And my concern would be, yes, the short-term acute use of modafinil, to keep you awake for 1 or 2 days or whatever's needed, probably not a problem. But if you're a shift worker and you're using it all the time, my concern would be you might, in a sense, you become dependent upon it because your brain simply needs that level of stimulation to work. We don't know. And that would be one of the concerns I would have with those sorts of drugs. But as I say, we don't know yet whether that's a problem.
What about caffeine? Good old coffee.
Well, caffeine is as effective. The data have shown that caffeine is as effective as modafinil at keeping you awake. So I forget what the equivalent doses are, but let's say 6 espressos can really be extremely effective. And what caffeine is doing, there we have an understanding of the biology, because there's two processes of sleep. One is the body clock. Now is a good time to be awake. Now is a good time to be asleep. And that's what's happening over the 24-hour day. But the intuitive part about sleep is the longer you've been awake, the greater the sleep pressure, the need for sleep. And so what caffeine does is block the receptors for the sleep pressure.
Oh, wow.
And so, yeah, and so that's how it can be effective. And in fact, it's blocking, there's a substance called adenosine. And adenosine has been shown to build up in the brain as we stay awake. And if you put adenosine into the brain, it can induce sleep. And it's caffeine in coffee which is blocking those adenosine receptors. So that's part of why coffee has its alerting effects.
So if you were...
it takes about 20 minutes to 30 minutes to kick in. So if you're driving, the recommendation is, and you have to continue to drive and you can't go off the road and sleep, then you take a cup of coffee, but you wait 20 to 30 minutes for the caffeine to kick in. You don't have your coffee and then immediately drive, because you'll still be sleepy for 20 minutes or so. The other thing also is that our ability to sense our own sleepiness is really bad. You ask cab drivers, do you have problems on the night shift? And they say, no, I'm perfectly fine. It's great. And then you test their abilities to perform tasks and they're shot. Mm-hmm. And it's a really important appreciation, because you're impaired. Because you're so impaired, you don't know how impaired you are. Mm. Then you do really stupid things. I mean, not only do you not sense appropriately your surroundings, but you become impulsive. You're much more likely to do sort of stupid things in a car when you're tired, because the brain isn't allowed to be reflective and use all of its huge capacity to assessing the situation.
How much sleep do you get a night, sir?
That's a very personal question.
Those Oxford professors. I mean, it's sex all the time.
when I sit here do I feel I'm overly impulsive? Am I irrational? Am I irritable? Am I all of these bad things? I think not. But then, as I said earlier, one's so impaired when you're sleep deprived, I wouldn't be able to assess whether I was any of those things. I probably should get a bit more sleep than I do.
We all should.
What's really interesting is that, the sleeping habits of one's partners are quite fascinating. So there's a study which suggests that the longest surviving partnerships are between morning types, those that like to get up in the early morning and go to bed early, and evening types, those that people go to bed and get up late. And the cynic might say it's because they don't see much of each other.
So you mean if one partner is a morning person, the other's a night person, they get along, they stay together longer?
Well, the longest surviving relationships tend to be between morning people and evening people. So that's the cynical interpretation is that, of course, they don't see much of each other. I would prefer to suggest that if you can accommodate your partner's sleeping habits, then all of the other trials and tribulations of a relationship fall into insignificance by comparison. So if you manage to deal with that, everything else is easy.
That's exactly
very
right.
poetic.
I love. We're getting marital advice from the man as well. It's fantastic. So it's. I am a night person. And part of it's just maybe because I'm a stand-up comic and I get off stage at 1 a.m, but I just do better at night. I have more energy starting at 6 p.m. and I can go till 2, and then if I left to my druthers, I'll sleep until 10, and that's great for me.
And I think it's very good for people to assess whether they're morning people or evening people, or whether they fall in between. The only thing I would say is that, are you sure that your late habits aren't being fueled by things like coffee and other stimulants?
I don't drink a lot of coffee I don't drink coffee after 4 p.m. I don't.
Okay, well that's I mean, clearly the advice is that you shouldn't drink coffee much after lunchtime.
Okay.
Because caffeine can stay in the circulation for really quite a long time. It has what's called a half-life of 5 to 9 hours, and different people have different sensitivities to the caffeine. And the problem is, if you fuel the waking day with caffeine, and if you're a really naughty brain, nicotine through cigarettes, then of course you're completely wired, and you think, oh my goodness, I've got to be awake in 6-7 hours time. How am I going to get to sleep? Then you take sedatives in the form of either sleeping tablets or indeed alcohol. Mm. Now both are great sedatives, but they don't provide a biological mimic for sleep. So some of those processes that you normally gain from during sleep, memory consolidation, the processing of information, all the rest of it, can actually be harmed to some extent by the sedation that you get from alcohol or sleeping tablets.
How about marijuana? How is that as a sedative? I've heard a lot of people who smoke it and they can't go to bed without it. I mean, I know two writers like that.
Yeah, I don't know of any of the specific data, so I can't comment. But I don't know. It'd be interesting to know really what does go on in terms of brain activity and the processing of information after sleep induced by marijuana. I simply don't know the answer to that. But many. It sort of highlights the sort of thing we were touching on earlier, which is, do we have any good drugs to regulate sleep? And we really don't. There are, we talked about Modafinil, Provigil, we've talked about stimulants such as caffeine and sedatives such as alcohol, but they all have side effects. And the great problem about having that sort of drive of caffeine during the day and then alcohol at night, many night shift workers have suffer from substance abuse, and of course you get locked into that really vicious circle of more stimulants because you're waking up tired, more sedation because you're wired, poorer sleep, therefore more stimulants in the morning, and that stimulant sedative feedback loop it can be a real problem. And it's not just, though, in night shift workers. I mean, increasingly, the sleep of teenagers is disrupted. And we can talk about why, I guess, in a minute. I mean, I
loved your sort of suggestion that students should start their day at 10 a.m.
And I think there's a good argument for that. Where it's been done in the States, a wonderful researcher in the States called Mary Carskadon at Brown University has really been the pioneer in this area. And we know from studies also in Germany, in the States and Canada, that there is this biological predisposition for teenagers to go to bed late and get up late. And that peaks in males at around about 21 and a half, in females about 19. Males tend to be more night owls than females, but there's that drift. And then from the age of sort of around about 21, 19 in women, then it reverses. And then at the age of about 55, 60, men and women are getting up and going to bed at about the same time that they did when they were 11. But that's about 2 hours different from teenagers. So getting a teenager up at 7 o'clock in the morning is like getting a 55-year-old up at 5 o'clock in the morning. It's that big an effect.
That's amazing.
It is extraordinary. And now the problem we have is that the tendency now, of course, is to couple that biological predisposition to go to bed late and get up late with all the other stuff that's going on in the teenage bedroom. The texting, the gaming. And that then means that sleep can be really, really late. And that's the great problem. And what nobody's telling teenagers is how their life can be enhanced by sleep. Essentially, sleep is being used as sort of this punitive thing. You must go to sleep. Not you should go to sleep because you're going to feel a better person, you're going to be healthier for it, you're going to have a better sense of humor, you're going to crack better jokes, and you're going to do better at school.
That's also changing the culture, isn't it? I mean, again, sleep has been, for whatever reason, maybe it's the industrial age, it still is synonymous. Well, you need a lot of sleep. If anybody's ever been in a relationship, there is a competition to see who gets less sleep and who's tougher.
Yeah.
Well, don't act like you get way more sleep than I do, especially if you have kids. I know that's a point of contention.
It goes way before even the Industrial Revolution. I mean, Longfellow used to refer to sleep as those little slices of death. And
that was Edgar Allan Poe, wasn't it?
I thought it was Longfellow, but maybe it was.
Was it Longfellow?
I mean, I've been wrong on this podcast once already. Why not double down, right?
I'll defer to the Harvard man on that.
But and then the other one that I always loved was that Da Vinci said that sleep was the enemy of genius. Or something like that. But I mean, there's this idea. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's partly being tough, but it's also part of brilliant. The mad scientist doesn't need to sleep; that he's able to just there have been, ideate all day long.
Yeah, but Professor, there have been famous insomniacs, and why is it that some people need less sleep than others? And in fact, is that true? Do some people just need 4 hours?
And is Donald Trump lying when he says that he only needs
There are two issues. I mean, there is quite a bit of variability in sleep duration. There's no question about it. But as we said earlier, you've got to be really careful because it's like the taxi driver. You don't know how impaired you are, so you're actually pretty bad at assessing your own deficits after sleep deprivation. I mean, it's really not great. However, what's the variation? Well, we talked about the sleep pressure, the buildup of substances like adenosine within the brain, and that there are receptors in the brain that detect that adenosine and then tend to put you into sleep. Now, there can be variation in those receptors in the brain, and so your sensitivity to adenosine and indeed caffeine can be different, and part of how much sleep you need is part of it could be due to how sensitive you are to that buildup of sleep pressure.
And just for the record, it was Edgar Allan Poe, so you're right, Professor.
Oxford wins again, ladies and gentlemen. Hooray for Oxford! Yeah.
But I think it's also worth it when we're talking about quotes. I mean, just think of the glorious Shakespearean quotes about sleep. What is it?
Sleep, perchance to dream.
Nature's soft nurse, how have I forsaken thee? I mean, just beautiful.
Yeah.
I mean, just there's so many references to sleep and dreaming in the Shakespearean time, which is so contrasted to the 20th century, when we had Edison saying things like what was it? Sleep is a criminal waste of time and a throwback to our cave days.
Wow.
And it's the way the 20th century has essentially rejected sleep because almost the invention of the light bulb. We could invade the night. Because we can invade the night, then sleep has been by far the first victim.
And the other thing that I think that is interesting too is that what about light pollution? I mean, we talk about having a dark room, but presumably even if you could block all the light out of your room, that wouldn't necessarily be good because you need that filtering in of the light in the early morning to begin to wake you up. So, I mean, we have a lot of light pollution. If you're living in a city, it's pretty much impossible to be able to both block out that nighttime light and at the same time get that morning light that's waking you up. It seems like a catch-22.
It is a bit, and so that's why people have used those alarm clocks, which turn on the light, and instead of an alarm, you get this increasing level of brightness by the bed. And the data on those is quite interesting. They do seem to work quite well, and waking from an increasing light level from those sorts of alarm clocks seems to be good. You're right, though. Of course, as the seasons expand and contract, I mean, really morning light during the spring and the summer gets you up earlier than you need to be, particularly if you've gone to bed late.
So you recommend? What about eye shades, like covering your eyes?
Yeah.
Good idea.
I mean, that's what people do on aircraft, and that works. Essentially, you're doing two things. I mean, you're blocking light, increasing levels of alertness, and of course that will promote sleep. And of course, you're giving yourself a very robust sleep-wake cycle. You're enhancing the appropriate light-dark cycle on the clock.
I ate last night, I think, too early. I mean, too late. And I woke up at 4 a.m, tossing and turning, couldn't go back to bed for, an hour and a half.
What did you eat?
I ate Indian food. So what, talk about, when we should eat. And I would imagine it varies from person to person. But I think I'm the kind of person that needs to eat way earlier than most. It doesn't do well with me.
Yeah, and in fact, there's some good data showing that our ability to process many elements of food are impaired late into the evening, and indeed even gut motility. The rate at which we can push food through the digestive system also changes at night. Our ability to process fats, so the triglycerides, the so-called bad fats. If you give a constant infusion of triglycerides over the 24-hour day, the ability to clear those triglycerides from the circulation is much worse at night than it is in the day. And again, that raises some really important issues for night shift workers. What's the food that we give to night shift workers? It's high in fat, it's high in glucose, it's ghastly to digest. And what do you get in night shift workers? High rates of cardiovascular disease, high rates of stomach ulcers, and all those sorts of things. And I think it raises a really interesting point, because we're not going to put the 24/7 genie back in its bottle. You're going to have night shift work. Our society is too dependent upon it. But knowing that you can't process food at night, then we should be providing our night shift workers with more appropriate nutrition that is that matches on to the gut's ability to process food at that time of day.
Like what? Like whole foods, things that are easier to, less sugar, less saturated.
Absolutely.
I mean,
Because you get one of the problems about the cravings for high sugar, and you get this great sugar rush, but the crash, once it's been cleared from the circulation, then you get that rebound, and then you feel very, very sleepy after it. And so that sort of stuff just isn't really being taken into account for our night shift workers.
I think that we'd solve a lot of our health care issues if people knew more, first of all, about nutrition. We don't. I travel this country. I'm talking about the United States a great deal, and the number of people that just have no idea, that essentially live on wheat and soy and sugar, and they're just so overweight, and they just lack energy. I mean, the amount of drinking and the amount of just people just don't have the information. It's amazing. It's just we have an industry that caters to selling foods that are probably, fast food is the way it is. I mean, there are a lot of places in this country where it's actually difficult to get nutritious, easy to digest, simple food.
But you'd think, though, that if the food manufacturers were smart, they'd realize that 20% of the working population is working at the wrong time of day. There's a huge market there. Why don't they start, developing the appropriate nutrition and the appropriate food for people who are active at that time of day? I mean, it's a phenomenally large market that would make great profits.
But it starts with people like you. That's what's fascinating. It really does start with scientists like yourself who do this primary research and then get the word out. It really does. I mean, that's if you think about how things change. Ansel Keys came along and said, he did some shoddy studies and said, well, a high carbohydrate, high fiber, low fat diet's the way to go. In fact, no. In fact, probably it looks like, if you look at the new science on nutrition and some of the primary research being done, high carbohydrate, eating a low fat, high carb diet, and even though it's got fiber, in fact, spikes your insulin and leads to a whole bunch of metabolic issues. It ain't the fat, it's probably the sugar and the simple carbs that we have to be careful of. That was not the case. One guy can come along with the wrong research and change the whole an entire movement.
Absolutely.
Create a movement, and we had an obesity epidemic. I mean, there's a lot of good research done, but people like you who come along and say, listen, man, there are simple ways to fix this so you can, at the end of the day, feel better, be more productive, be more yourself. That's what I love about what you're doing.
Well, I should say that there's some fantastic work going on in the States by Ev Van Kouter, and what Ev has shown is the impact of shortened sleep deprivation on the metabolic axis. And she took healthy young males. One group had 4 hours of sleep a night, the other group had up to 10 hours of sleep a night. And then after 7 days, she looked at the levels of the hunger hormone called ghrelin. Ghrelin was up by 28%. This is after 7 days, healthy young males. So ghrelin was up by 28%. Carbohydrate consumption had gone up by 35 to 40%. And the ability to clear glucose from the circulation was bordering on the diabetic. So these are healthy young males, who've been sleeping 4 hours a night for 7 days. And okay, that's quite rare, but it illustrates the important relationship between the sleep axis and the metabolic axis. And others would argue that perhaps a significant contributing factor to the obesity, diabetes 2 that we're facing now is hugely reduced sleep. I mean, even since the 1960s, the average amount of sleep per adult and child seems to have dropped by about 1.5 hours per night.
Wow, that's a huge number.
Yeah.
That's a huge number.
And people then tend to oversleep at the weekend, but they never fully repay that sleep debt. And again,
so you can't really. I thought you could make up sleep. I thought you could.
Not completely.
Okay.
No. And the teenager, of course, will classically oversleep hugely, but then that's a problem because that'll reduce the sleep pressure, which means that they'll go to bed even later the next night, so they get caught into that sort of trap of not really trying to stabilize their sleep. I mean, what Mary Caskoden has shown is that the average teenager needs about 9 hours of sleep every night for full brain performance. And so 9.5 hours before the alarm clock goes off, the teenager needs to sort of start taking some responsibility, reducing light, building in sort of a wind-down program. You mentioned earlier some background music, something that you find relaxing. You just adopt those habits that promote sleep. You certainly don't start gaming or texting or doing all the sorts of other things that keep you awake.
What about the average adult? How much does the average adult need to sleep?
It's slightly less than the teenager. It's sort of estimated to be about 7 to 8 hours. Again, there's a lot of individual variation. But if, as a rule of thumb, you say 7.5 to 8 hours, that's about right.
What about as athletes? I'd imagine need more sleep.
It's very interesting. There is a bit of evidence that athletes do need more sleep. But funnily enough, couch potatoes sleep even more than athletes. So it's not absolutely clear. You'd think that you were burning up all those calories, and as an athlete, you'd need more sleep. But actually, as I said, couch potatoes have been shown to sleep more.
Does the introduction of testosterone, if you're taking testosterone, if you have higher levels of testosterone, do we know if you need less sleep when that's the case?
It's a really interesting question, and we don't know the specific answer because it could be the sex steroids like testosterone and estrogen. There's changes during puberty that are changing the sleep timing. So that getting later and later and later may well be due to increasing levels of the sex steroids. And of course, the decline after and the decline. I just need to turn that off. And the decline in those sex steroids as you go from the early 20s into middle age and beyond also correlates with that shortening of sleep. So we have some indirect evidence that those hormones could be involved in sleep timing. Certainly in animal studies, if you give an injection of testosterone or estrogen, you can change the onset of the rest activity cycle.
So I had a quick question to go back to the cells that you discovered, the pRGCs. The pRGCs. Are they sensitive to a particular frequency or frequencies of light?
That's a really good question. They are most sensitive to the blue part of the spectrum. So imagine the blue of a really blue sky. Then that's where they're most sensitive.
So do those blue daylight light bulbs actually make a difference? Are they good for you? Do they,
Well, so there's a slight dilemma here. Of course, the response curve of these cells, like other receptors, is a bit like a bell-shaped distribution. They're maximally sensitive in the blue. But it doesn't mean to say that if the light isn't bright enough, they can absorb in the green and the yellow and even into the near red. So it depends on how bright the light is. If you want dim light and you want it to be effective, then you'd enrich it in blue. But if you've got bright enough white light, that'll be fine.
So then to go back to sunglasses, because obviously sunglasses focus on cutting out the UV, which is towards the blue end of the spectrum. I mean,
but that's good because UV is a lot shorter than the 480 nanometers, which is where these cells peak. I mean, UV would be 360 or a little bit longer, but we're talking 480. So on the blue side of the spectrum, but nowhere near the ultraviolet side.
So we don't have to worry about our sunglasses affecting our sleep cycle or anything like that. I mean, for blind what's the deal there?
Well, it's quite interesting because, of course, morning light exposure is the most important for humans for setting the biological clock. So, we were talking about good sleep hygiene. So there's things you do before you go to bed, but also to help stabilize sleep is get out there and get morning light exposure. And that really is very effective at setting the clock. Now, if you're going around with sunglasses all the time, then you will reduce the strength of that signal, that clock-setting signal. So you have to be a bit careful. Sunglasses, it's actually very interesting because of jet lag. I mean, when you're traveling west, it doesn't really matter. You basically seek out light when you can find it. However, when you're traveling east for more than 6 or 7 time zones, then what you need to do is avoid morning light and then seek out afternoon light. And so sunglasses can be quite useful when you're traveling east for, let's say you were traveling from the West Coast to the UK.
Yeah.
Then for the first few days, you'd avoid morning light and you'd seek out afternoon light. And that's been shown to to speed up the rate you can lock onto local
because
time.
the afternoon light correlates with your morning light, your morning cycle, in other words.
Precisely, yeah.
I was going to ask you about that. Like, how do we what is the best way to deal with jet lag? How do I get myself onto? Because if I travel to the UK, forget it. You're just up all night and you wake up at 2 in the afternoon, and even when I travel, when I go from the West Coast to the East Coast, because even the East Coast needs my comedy professor, even the East Coast, and
especially the East Coast. Yeah. I mean, those old fuddy-duddies.
And they wait in line. They don't get any sleep. They wait in line all night for tickets. But the point is, how do I? A lot of times I'll just wake up when I wake up. I mean, I just draw the shades, man. And stay on my cycle.
I mean, it is tricky. I mean, the paper we just published this fantastic paper in a journal called Cell. Now, in my world, that's the very, very top journal you can get into. And actually, it's the molecular first real molecular understanding we've got of jet lag. And the sort of the big question we try to address is, well, why doesn't the clock just lock on to the new light-dark cycle? Why does it take a day for every time zone you've crossed to adapt? And what we've shown is that at the level of the molecular clock, when light hits the clock, it starts a process which begins to shift the clock to the local time environment. But another process goes on which effectively turns it off. So what we've done is take this protein, knock it down within the master clock in the brain of a mouse, shift the mouse light-dark cycle by 6 hours, and instead of taking 6 days to adapt, it's adapted by almost the first day. So there's some really interesting processes going on.
And you did that with light, or how did you do that?
Yeah, we did that with light, but it's so essentially by taking this break off of the clock, you can hugely increase the effects of light on the clock. And so we've now actually working on some drugs which we think can manipulate that pathway. It's we don't have a drug for jet lag, but at least we've now got a pathway and some agents that we're working on, which could in theory provide us with something useful in a few years' time.
Wow!
So we're working on that.
Fascinating.
Curing jet lag.
Curing jet lag and getting people to sleep.
Yeah.
It's I consider it. I say this periodically because we have some great people on here, and I consider it a privilege to be able to talk to somebody like you who's making such a difference. Your work is obviously very valuable, and I hope on this podcast we did our job to at least get it out there a little bit more, because people like you really do. It starts with you. It starts with guys like you and men and women like you who have this, who have the balls to come out and say, by the way, I know you've been doing this research for 150 years, and you were all wrong. There's something else to look at, and that's a daunting task. I'm sure you dealt with a lot of people telling you that you were crazy or that you didn't know what you were talking about, and it looks like you were right. Yeah.
But what it did, of course, was promote better and better science. We did better experiments, and we've finally nailed it. I have to say, it's also been terrific chatting to you guys. But actually, it's extremely important for scientists to talk, because it's really important to remember that it's the general public who pay our wages. Mm-hmm. And therefore, we have an absolute duty and responsibility to tell the general public, the non-scientists who are paying our wages, what we're doing. And so to have the opportunities of explaining some of the science, I think is fantastic.
Well, it's also very important because a lot of times the wrong ideas get out there. And when the wrong idea wins the day, man, you've got it can cause a great deal of damage. And you're right. There was this movement in Los Angeles especially, where vaccines were suddenly the enemy, and it was these big pharma. They were just trying to make money, and and so vaccines were causing autism and things like that. Well, the science suggests, in fact, that, and if you pick up a history book, for God's sake, vaccines along with antibiotics and anesthesia are the greatest things in the world. They have pushed us so far beyond our biology. We don't have to bury our children anymore, like Lincoln did. In my country, like our the elite of the world were burying their children all the time. You don't have that anymore. Burying a child, which is a great index for misery, probably the best yardstick for it. That, thank God, is a rare thing. We don't bury our children because they got measles or typhus or all those other things, diphtheria and all those things that would roll through a community. And so I think you're right. I think it's so important and you're such an articulate guy. That's one of the reasons I want to get you on here. And you got great humor. And people like you are so important because it's one thing to do the research. It's another thing to get it out there. People need to hear it because they will listen to you. They will listen to a professor.
And they're curious. I think that's the point. I mean, there are all these questions that, we don't have an opportunity to ask.
Look, exactly. I spend a lot of time. As you know, I'm obsessed with health, and I love the idea of just how can I get this machine to work. I'm on stage for 3 hours a night, so and I'm moving around a lot, and I'm using my voice. I can't break down, so I've had to really investigate. But it's amazing how little I knew about sleep, by the way. And I've listened to 2 of your lectures already, but I learned a whole lot just now. That's where it becomes very important. So you are much appreciated on this side of the pond.
The pond. I did have one other question, which is, what about people who live at really high latitudes? I mean, if you're living near the Arctic Circle, your days.
Oh yeah. What about the Inuit, Professor?
This is so interesting. Now, okay, so let's talk about what we do know, which is what happens to Arctic animals during the Arctic winter. And so some lovely stuff from University of Tromsø, Karl-Arne Stokken, for example, has shown that during the Arctic winter, those reindeers will turn off their body clocks. They don't show 24-hour rhythms at all because it's constantly dark, and essentially the weather conditions are so ghastly, they will feed whenever the weather conditions permit. So they actually turn their clocks off. So they have this incredible facility. But then they've evolved to that environment, and they've been there for 30, 40,000 years or more. So what do we know about humans? Well, the only sort of real studies that have been looked at, I suppose, is seasonal affective disorder, and that's the incidence of this as the shortening day lengths approach during the autumn and winter months. This increased lethargy, this increased desire for carbohydrates, this depression that can develop, and the incidence of seasonal affective disorder increases very markedly as you go away to the equator. And it's been estimated in 69 degrees north, 29% of the European population have seasonal affective disorder. I mean, they have a form of SAD. And of course, it's all the light boxes that are being used there as a countermeasure. However, if you look at the population on Iceland, they don't have much SAD. They should have high levels, but it's 1 or 2%, which is the sort of the thing you'd find, in South North Carolina. And so it may well be that population went through what's called such a bottleneck, such a small number of people, established the population in Iceland, that they selected for a bunch of genes which prevented, getting seasonal affective disorder.
Wow.
We don't know about the Inuit. There's some proposals to study the native peoples who live up in the north, but those studies are quite difficult to do, and so we don't know whether they have seasonal depression or other.
They are physiologically different in a lot of ways. My friend spent a while up there, and for example, their hands and feet don't get cold the way ours do. They regulate their body temperature very, very well.
There's a lovely story about the Inuit, which is whether they showed breeding cycles that were seasonal, because up until fairly recently, 80% of all births in the Inuit were going on in March. And people are saying, oh my goodness, that's really interesting. They must be being controlled by day length, the increasing and decreasing day lengths which control the reproduction of sheep and birds and all the rest of it. Maybe it's also going on in humans. And then somebody actually bothered to ask the Inuit, why do you think it is that most of your children, they said, well, if you count back 9 months, it's the middle of the year, and that's the only time we get any privacy.
Oh, man. That makes
amazing.
Sense. That makes sense. Yeah, you might want to ask the very people that you're studying.
It's amazing how rarely that's done.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Professor, I can't thank you enough. This has been very educational.
And I just bought Sleep, a very short introduction. I'm very much looking forward to reading it. I just bought it online
now. The other book is Rhythms of Life, the biological clocks that control the daily lives of every living thing. And then you have another book as well?
Yes, Seasons of Life, which is, and that's also with my co-author, Leon Kreitzman. So Leon and I, we were asked so many questions about seasonal biology after we wrote the one on annual, daily biology, that we thought we'd cover that. And there's some incredible changes going on over the year, even in human physiology. And so
really?
Maybe we should talk about that at some point.
Yeah, I would love to. I'd love to have
great.
you back, man. I can talk to you. I got so many. I know I'm gonna, when we hang up, I'll be like, well, I wanted to ask him this one more thing. There's just so many questions, but I'm excited to see what do you think, as a final question? I mean, it's a hard thing to answer, but what do you think what more is there to learn about sleep? I mean, what is the new frontier? Is it coming up with technologies and drugs and things that allow us to sleep much less? Will we ever get there?
I think it's still the understanding the fundamental biology of sleep. I mean, a big chunk of what we're doing at the moment is trying to understand the fundamental neuroscience of sleep. And that's shedding light on a whole range of different other areas of brain function. So, for example, what you find in psychiatric illness, such as schizophrenia, bipolar, and even depression, is hugely disrupted sleep. Now, why is that? The assumption has been, well, it's as a result of individuals, they don't have a job, so they go to bed late, get up late, miss the clinic, all the rest of it. Or it's because of the antipsychotics or the drugs they're on. And yet we've known since the 1880s that severe sleep disruption occurs in mental illness. But again, it has been largely ignored and disrupted. So we came up with a new hypothesis, which is that actually the mechanisms in the brain that give rise to normal sleep overlap with those areas of the brain that give rise to normal mental health. If you have a defect in, let's say, a bit of the brain that predisposes you to mental illness, you're almost certainly going to have an effect upon sleep. The sleep then will then feed back and make the mental illness worse, and then the mental illness could make the sleep worse.
That's amazing. That's amazing.
So we published last year some of the first evidence for this, which is that if you have a gene that's been linked to human schizophrenia and you mutate that gene in a mouse, the mouse sleep-wake falls apart, just like the patient's. So absolute empirical evidence of a mechanistic overlap. But in the same way, we sort of proposed that if you start to stabilize sleep in mental illness, you could have a really beneficial impact upon the state of the individual. And so my colleague here in Oxford, Dan Freeman, has been able to partially stabilize sleep in patients with schizophrenia, and he's reduced the levels of paranoia by 50%.
Isn't that amazing? That's amazing.
So we've got this, I think, really exciting. We're understanding some of the fundamental mechanisms of these really important conditions, but also we can think of the sleep and circadian systems as new therapeutic targets. Stabilize them, and you can have a big impact upon the quality of life of individuals with conditions like mental illness. It's worth bearing in mind that, of course, mental illness is also associated with all of those other things like metabolic abnormalities, cardiovascular disease, overall poor health. And nobody's actually sat back to say, well, is the overall poor health in mental illness due to the sleep-wake disruption and the cognitive decline? So I think for us, that's one of the really exciting areas that we're moving into now.
Well, don't stop what you're doing and keep talking. You're making a difference. You are making a difference, sir. We really appreciate it.
Great pleasure. Thank you very much.
We'll be bothering you in the future.
So when you come over to the UK, you're going to have to take you to dinner in Oxford.
I would love it if I'm performing. I've had some offers to perform there, a number of offers. So you will be in the front row, sir.
That would be terrific. Okay.
Yeah, I would love to. I would love to grab a pint and talk more about sleep and other things.
We'll go to the Bear, which is the oldest pub in Oxford.
You can count. Me and Hunter will be on a plane soon, man. That sounds fantastic, Professor. Thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for making
Bye-bye.
a difference. We'll see you later. Awesome. Just awesome, man. I love that.
Right. I've learned how to turn this thing off.
Yeah, I know. That was an awkward goodbye as we linger. He's a great man.
He is a great man.
He's a great man. Sorry about some of that feedback, guys. It's just the way it is when we're Skyping with Oxford professors.
Internationally.
Yeah, I like it. It actually adds a kind of an international thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry, everyone. We're having technical difficulties. Well, listen, man. I'm tired. I just know that. I got to get more sleep. I ate Indian food before I
Well,
went to
and I
bed.
think one of the things he said about us being so unaware of when we actually need sleep and all of that sort of stuff, I think that's really important. And I think that's so much of what is really coalescing, right? In terms of paying attention to your body, really being mindful of that.
Yeah.
And it really does take attention to like really notice what is going on with you, and I think that's one of the big movements that's coalescing.
I agree.
I
agree. I mean, it's sleep is as important as anything else that we do, and maybe more important.
Well, especially if you don't want to be a paranoid schizophrenic. Right?
It's so fascinating. It's so fascinating how
Right.
those scientists just make such a huge difference. Science is
Absolutely.
awesome. People like that are awesome. Just like you get a good feeling just looking at the guy. He's just a good person.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I hope you have learned everything once again. I want that to be the new slogan.
Yeah.
The Brian Callen Hunter Mops Show. Learn everything.
Listen, I actually got a tweet from someone who's saying, I'm not saying that I learn everything listening to the Brian Callen Show, but it's pretty close.
I love it. Learn everything. Can we let's patent that. I'm saying that now. I'm going to tweet that. The Brian Callen Show. Learn everything.
That's not that's
definitely a good T-shirt. All right.
Yeah. It's
All
also scientifically justified. I mean, you do learn everything.
You do learn everything. We have empirical evidence. Who said that accent? Well, of course, we've actually done a great deal of research. If you look at mice, for example, you can get away with anything with an accent like that. He's a good man. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, where am I going to be? I'm going to be doing stand-up. Go to briancallen.com. I'm going to be all over the place. Philly. Now, let me just go through it really quickly. I'm going to be in Philly. I'm going to be in Austin in January. I'm going to be in. I'm going to be all over, man. I'm going to be in. Well, actually, let's see. I'll be in the Tempe Improv December 19th, 20th, 21st. I will then be, and gosh, I'll be at the, no, I won't be there. I'll be in January. I'm going to be, I'll be at Laugh Boston, I think the 9th, 10th, and 11th. I'm excited about that. And then I'll be at Parlor Live January 18th. Well, actually, the 16th, 17th, and 18th in Seattle. I'll be in Cap Cities, Austin, the 23rd, 24th, and 25th of January. Anyway, just go to briancallen.com. And only if you want to learn everything.
Learn
and
everything.
Laugh hard.
Come on, Brian, echo that up.
Learn everything. Hunter, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
No, thank
you.
No, thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you,
No,
sir.
so much.
Thank you so much for tuning in.
Thank you.
You've been listening to The Brian Callen Show. Be sure to visit briancallen.com for information about this episode as well as past and future episodes. You can follow Brian on Twitter @Brian Callen and like him on Facebook. Go to facebook.com/Brian Callen Comedy. Thanks again for listening. We'll see you next time.